Modern scholarship would agree that the tomb was empty somewhere after the third day.
These four facts, the honorable burial of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the disciples' faith that God had raised Jesus from the dead, represent the views of the majority of New Testament critics who have written on these subjects. And I want to emphasize, I'm not talking here about conservative scholars or fundamentalists. I'm talking about the broad mainstream of scholarship. Those who deny it tend to be radical critics on the left-wing fringe of New Testament scholarship. But the majority of scholars who have written on these subjects agree with the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith in the resurrection of Jesus. Now, specifically with regard to the empty tomb, the majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that the tomb of Jesus was probably found empty by a group of his women followers early on Sunday morning. That represents the historical core of the empty tomb narrative as we find it in Mark.
Why do they find it credible?
The empty tomb story enjoys multiple independent lines of evidence. For example, as I've already indicated, the burial account supports the empty tomb story. If the burial account of Jesus is historically accurate, then the inference that the tomb was found empty is not very far at hand, because the resurrection faith could not have arisen and flourished in the face of a closed tomb. Secondly, I think that the empty tomb story is also multiply and independently attested in early sources. It's attested in the pre-Markan Passion source, that is the source that Mark used for writing his Gospels. But we also have independent sources for the empty tomb in Matthew and Luke, and also in John. This is evident, for example, from the fact that Matthew has a quite different account of the empty tomb, employing the idea of a guard story, which Matthew did not invent out of whole cloth, but which represented a tradition which Matthew received. Most scholars recognize that John's account of the empty tomb and the burial of Jesus is independent of the three synoptic Gospels. I also think that the empty tomb is implied, at least, in the formula handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. When you look at the third line of that formula, which says, "And he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures," that third line corresponds to the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels and to the empty tomb in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So again, it is a summary, an outline form of the wider story of the empty tomb.